Coming up, voters in New York will be asked this November whether to approve what's called a constitutional convention.
It's a very, very powerful right that we as New Yorkers have.
Should an independent commission consider major revisions and reforms to the state constitution? But could those changes also undo longtime safeguards, like protecting the Adirondack wilderness? We'll ask a panel of experts and scholars coming up next on this special edition of Mountain Lake Journal.
Mountain Lake Journal on Mountain Lake PBS is made possible in part by
Northern Insuring, guiding your way for 85 years with offices in Plattsburgh, Whitehall, and Messina, providing personal insurance, business insurance, and life and employee benefit services.
Northline Utilities creates employment and training opportunities for North Country residents with projects that build community and social infrastructure. We're family-focused and education-oriented. Power is our business and pride is our choice.
Knight Automotive, featuring a full selection of the entire Buick lineup in stock, and our world-class rated General Motors technician, Terry Relation, with 40 years of experience. Knight Automotive, Route 3, Plattsburgh.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special edition of Mountain Lake Journal. I'm Tom Halleck. Election day may still be months away, but many political leaders and watchdog groups in Albany are gearing up for a summer of heated debate over a referendum question that'll be on the ballot this November that supporters say can improve how state government works, and that opponents fear could make unnecessary changes to the state constitution and do more harm than good. Every 20 years, New Yorkers can vote on whether to hold what's called a constitutional convention, where a commission considers revisions to the state constitution. And while supporters say it is the only way to push through major reforms that the legislature won't address, holding a convention opens up the entire document for review and possible changes, which is why critics oppose it. They worry it could roll back labor rights and pension benefits for workers, care and aid for the needy, and wilderness protections for the Adirondacks, which could have a huge impact on the North Country. This week, we welcome a panel of experts to delve into the pros and cons of holding a constitutional convention. Here now to talk more in depth about the Constitutional Convention that we'll be voting on in November is Christopher Bobst, a constitutional scholar. Neil Woodworth is the executive director of the Adirondack Mountain Club. John Sheehan is the communications director for the Adirondack Council, the largest environmental group in the state. And Fred Monroe is executive director of the Adirondack Park Local Government Review Board. Welcome to you all. We appreciate you being here.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you for having us.
Chris, let's begin with you as a scholar. What is a constitutional convention and why is it up to voters to decide whether to have one?
Well, our state constitution, Tom, can be amended two different ways. One is by legislative amendment, which you probably have seen. Sometimes you go to the booths in November and you'll see different amendments and you vote on them. That's one way, and that can be done by the legislature passing two amendments in consecutively elected legislative sessions, and then it goes on the ballot. If it's approved by a majority of those voting on it, then it becomes part of our state constitution.
Sort of like we saw with the NICO mining question.
Correct, absolutely.
Land swap a couple of years ago.
And that's a very common way that the Constitution's been amended. It's been amended that way 228 times since 1894 when it was adopted. We also have a constitutional convention method. We haven't had a convention in New York State since 1967. Every 20 years, we as the voters have the power. It's a very, very powerful right that we as New Yorkers have to either say we're happy with the state constitution the way it is and we shouldn't change it, or we should have a convention and completely bypass the legislature and reform the state constitution.
So over the years, how many times has this happened and what sort of significant or historic changes have come out of these conventions?
We've actually, believe it or not, Tom, many of your viewers probably won't know this, but we've actually had 9 constitutional conventions in New York State history. The last one was in 1967, the one before was in 1938. And I would say that nearly every right that's in the New York State Constitution, either individual or collective, came out of constitutional conventions. A lot of what we point to with pride in the New York State Constitution was the product of a convention. The Forever Wild provision, which I know we'll be focusing on in great depth, was added by the Constitutional Convention of 1894. The provision in the New York State Constitution that provides that the state has to provide aid and care for its needy was added in 1938 by a constitutional convention. The Bill of Rights for organized labor, pension protections for public employees, both added by the convention of 1938.
And that was the last convention that really saw significant changes. There was another convention held in '67, and they recommended changes, but then the voters rejected it.
Correct.
So voters, if they say yes to holding a constitutional convention, it would be in 2 years in 2019. Who would be chosen to take part? Who would be the delegates?
There would be a delegate selection process. What would happen is that in 2018, the general election, November of 2018, delegates would be chosen. There would be 3 delegates chosen from each of the state's 63 state Senate districts. There would also be 15 at-large delegates that would be voted on statewide. So you would have a total of 204 delegates that would be elected in November of 2018.
So what kind of changes could they potentially make here? When it comes to education, they could change how we pay for education. When it comes to government, could they tackle ethics, term limits, or whether we take money out of politics? What is it that they can potentially cover?
Really, anything would be open, but I think that historically conventions have really mirrored the period in which they've been called. In 1938, the convention was held during the midst of the Great Depression. And many of the social policies, the social welfare policies, came out of that convention and renewed the role, or actually created a new role for the state in providing for the welfare of its citizens. Historically, conventions have reflected the conditions in which they were called. So in this case, I think the main issue on people's minds right now is corruption. I think they look and they say Albany's not working. We have dysfunction in state government. We have 2 of our elected leaders, both legislative leaders, convicted of felonies related to conduct in office within weeks of each other. And I think they see that and say, we need to do a better job of preventing the accumulation of this unchecked power that has contributed to these situations. So I think you could see things like term limits for either legislative members or the legislative leadership, where you wouldn't allow one individual to be the speaker for 17 years in a row and accumulate that type of power. I think you would see movements to have a truly independent redistricting commission to draw the lines so that the voters would be able to choose the representatives rather than have the representatives choose the voters. Right now, it's near impossible to lose re-election because you have bipartisan gerrymanders that protect each other's seats. I think those would be the real issues that the convention would focus on, because that's the issues that people are really upset about right now.
And do you gentlemen think there could be other pressing issues that we're seeing right now that would take priority at a constitutional convention?
Well, I have to say that Chris is very optimistic about the Constitutional Convention and what might come out of it in terms of good government. And I would certainly support efforts to clean up Albany. And agree with him on the various things that might be done. However, it's been my experience researching the conventions that the legislators and the political parties in New York have had a lot of role in picking the delegates. So there may be, while good government groups may want to clean up Albany, there may be the very people who are picking the delegates, who are recruiting the delegates, who are naming the statewide delegates, that really don't want to see these reforms happen because they've opposed them in the legislative arena. So I'm skeptical.
And Fred, as a town supervisor, are there a number of issues you think could be addressed at a constitutional convention that the legislature isn't addressing now?
Well, the ethics reform is an obvious one, and and we're most concerned about Article 14. There's many issues that we see with Article 14 that impact local government that we would love to see resolved, and there's been some efforts in the legislature to do that, namely a proposed amendment that passed last year, both houses, and passed the Senate so far this year, But if those efforts don't work, or if there's unacceptable horse trading going on, then I think local government would support constitutional amendment as an option with a lot of risks, but one that may be the only fallback position they have. Yeah.
And you're talking about Article 14.
Article
we're going to focus.
14, right.
We're going to focus a lot on that
Okay.
because that could
Right.
have quite an impact on the Adirondack Park up here in the northern part of the state. Just for a little background, and I'll throw this out to whoever may be the best at doing this. The Forever Wild Clause was one of the major changes made during the Constitutional Convention of 1894. Why was that put in the state constitution at that time?
Well, actually, it was almost lightning in a bottle that it happened. In 1886, the state legislature had created the Forest Preserve and passed a law called essentially the Forever Wild Law to accompany that protected the Forest Preserve from logging and lease and sale. In 1892, 6 years later, the legislature created the Adirondack Park and then repealed the Forever Wild Law, which was very much a mixed blessing in terms of the public's reaction. However, the public was not able to get the legislature to do much about that in the ensuing years, and in the middle of the convention, after it had already been seated, after all of the topics had been assigned to committee, the New York City Board of Trade and Transportation and a political club in Brooklyn brought forth this idea to reinstate the Forever Wild Law into the Constitution so it couldn't be repealed again. The whole group thought it was a terrific idea. They unanimously approved it, and it went on to be approved amidst the rejection of most of the other provisions that were created during that constitutional convention. So if it had been proposed as part of the convention, it's possible we would have gotten a very different set of delegates and that there would have been great opposition to it. But the fact that it's kind of snuck in under the radar made it possible for it to happen. And we're kind of concerned that that's not necessarily going to be the conditions the next time around.
The clause says that all land owned by the state of New York in the Adirondack and Catskill parks be added to the State Forest Preserve and be required to be kept forever wild and given the highest degree of protection. Is there a consensus that this was a good step and for the most part over the past century plus has worked and worked well?
I think it's worked exceptionally well. I think that it really has protected the great wildlands in the Catskills that furnish the New York City water supply and made it possible to have the largest surface water supply in the world that's unfiltered because of that degree of protection for much of the land in the Catskill High Peaks. In the Adirondacks, the Forever Wild concept has allowed, prior to one of the reasons for having the Forever Wild protection was the large-scale indiscriminate logging and timbering that occurred and made the Adirondack Park really a tinderbox for huge fires that burned the park in the latter part of the 19th century. And the recovery of much of the land in the Adirondacks, so we have the magnificent forests. You fly over the Adirondacks today, you don't see the scars of these huge forest fires. And it really looks like Alaska in many ways, in the character and quality of the wilderness. And I think we have the Forever Wild Clause to thank for that.
And the reason the New York Board of Trade and Transportation was interested in protecting the Adirondacks to begin with was the deforestation of the park that Neil just described and the forest fires were threatening the viability of the Hudson River and the Erie Canal as a transportation system. The reason New York City is the biggest city in America and has the wealthiest trade of all cities in America is that it has the one level water route to the Midwest and the Great Lakes. And from 1817 forward, that was the major highway for goods and transportation in the United States. So the Forever Wild Clause is the reason that remained viable. And there are still lakes devoted to the canal inside the Adirondacks that haven't been tapped yet. We hope they never have to be. But that waterway was really the heart of the reason New York is the Empire State and the reason that Wall Street's where it is now instead of at the foot of the Mississippi River.
Are there cons? Are there problems that came out of?
Local government's position is that there's been many unintended consequences, that there was not adequate attention paid to the impact on the economy of the residents and on the local governments. And we're seeing much of that happen now, and that's the reason for the proposed amendment that passed in the legislature last year. There's health and safety implications. There's water wells that are needed for municipalities that can't be drilled on forest preserve land without a constitutional amendment. There's bridges that need to be built. In my county, I was the chairman of the Warren County Board of Supervisors for 3 years. We've been trying, as Neil knows, for 10 years to get a bridge built that's desperately needed. It crosses 20 feet of forest preserve land on each side of a river. It requires a constitutional amendment to build that bridge. There's examples of municipal highways that need to be straightened or to remove obstacles or dangerous conditions. If that was a state highway, the Constitution has a 400-acre land bank that can be used for those kind of projects. No such thing for municipal government. There's many other examples that just indicate that not much attention was paid to local government, to residents' impacts, and those impacts have become even greater as the state acquires more and more land over the years.
So those restrictions have hurt municipalities. Has it hurt the growth of municipalities? Has it hurt development?
We believe it has, because you can't take an economy that was based on mining and forestry and lock up much of the land that's used for the forestry or the mining and not have it impact the economy. That's our sense of it.
You talk about the unintended consequences.
Right.
Is the legislature and Senator Betty Little up this way trying to address that with
Yes.
this land bank amendment?
Yes.
The legislature has voted for it last year, a second vote taking place this year. Would that ease a lot of the problems that municipalities are facing?
That would ease a lot of the problems, and I think it's been a good process, and that there's been people that are very knowledgeable on these complex issues that have gotten together and come to a consensus that this amendment makes sense. And it remains to be seen whether it'll pass the Assembly this year and pass a statewide vote.
But I think we want to point out that both John's organization and the Adirondack Mountain Club support this,
Right.
and are working alongside Fred and his colleagues to get this amendment passed.
Right.
There is wide agreement that the Forest Preserve has worked, that Forever Wild has worked. I don't hear people saying we should take this away, that this is an unsuccessful provision of the Constitution. And I think the legislative amendment process does work better than a convention for purposes of Forever Wild. But I don't think a convention is going to dedicate the majority of its work, or even a substantial part of its work, on something that's working. They're going to be there to try to fix what's not. And I can tell you, if you're happy with a legislature that is mired in a pay-to-play culture with 3 men in a room, that draws its own borders, that draws its own districts, if you're happy with the judiciary that's the most Byzantine in the nation, and I know we have some lawyers on this panel who practiced in that court system, and that cost the state, litigants, and municipalities $500 million a year because of inefficiencies. If you're happy with an education funding system that's a political football every year, if you're happy with the relationship the state has with its local governments, which nearly every state and local, or every county executive thinks is a nightmare, and I'm sure Fred can back me up on that. If you're happy with all of those things, great, then you should vote no. Otherwise, the legislature's not going to change these things, because if they were going to, they would have in the last 40 years, and they haven't. And that's why I think a convention is necessary. Will it be successful? I'm not saying for sure it will, but I can tell you it will not be done through the legislature, because it would have been already.
And those are the issues that you point to, why when it's necessary. Neil, do you and John worry about opening Pandora's box?
I worry that if, first of all, I'm not convinced. I'm not convinced that it's going to be as open and democratic a process as Chris has hopes for. I think that the political machinery of the state will exercise a great deal of control over who's selected as a delegate and what those delegates do, because that has happened in the past. And I'm concerned that a number of changes might be put into a package. Maybe it's attractive to certain large groups. Maybe it's attractive to some business interests, Chris. But what I'm worried about is somebody will sneak some changes into Article 14, the Forever Wild Clause, and then it gets passed. We could stop those things from happening in the normal legislative process, but if we're just a plank in with a whole bunch of other ideas, and it's packaged as one package, and we go up or down, we could see serious changes to Article 14. The Environmental Law Section Task Force on this issue looked at the Constitutional Convention and saw a great deal of peril for Article 14 in having a Constitutional Convention.
When there's a constitutional convention, do the delegates have all the authority, or would there be public hearings and public input as part of that process before they make a final decision or make their recommendations?
Delegates, as far as I know.
The delegates are allowed to conduct hearings, and sometimes they'll conduct hearings throughout the state. So I would believe that if there were to be any revisions to Forever Wild, they would probably conduct a hearing that would attempt to solicit public opinion from those communities that are affected by it.
The delegates determine their own processes.
Correct, yes. They get to make their own rules.
And what their decision is does go to the voters. So if they make the recommendation to make any changes to Forever Wild, it would go to the voters in November of 2019 to decide whether or not to accept those.
I think one of the things that you have to remember, though, is that when our Environmental Law Section group looked at even changes that very good lawyers thought would be beneficial, those of us who had actually litigated Article 14 saw as, for example, some folks wanted to remove the very important words "as now fixed by law" that applies to the ambit of the Forever Wild Clause. They saw that as unnecessary surplus language. We saw it as incredibly protective. The great Dean Semerad of Albany Law School, who is one of the experts on the Forever Wild Clause, explained why it would be very dangerous for that language to be removed, because it basically locks the whole Forever Wild, kept as wild forest concept in. Without that language, we could have the legislature decide that that a certain part of the Adirondacks should be managed for white-tailed deer or managed for all-terrain vehicle riding. And while I don't think any of us here would support that, it could happen if you took that language out.
There are certain issues in the news that get people thinking about this and get them thinking about the Constitutional Convention. Certainly right now there's a classification process going on in the Adirondacks for some of the latest acquisition for the state of New York, the Boreas Ponds tract, and how to classify that as far as how much should be wilderness or to what degree recreation should be allowed on those lands. Right. Is there a concern that people hearing about this may say, well, this is a time to open this up and really have a discussion about how much state land the state should buy, how much more it should buy, and how we should be classifying those lands? Or
even how to manage those lands.
Or how to manage those
because
lands.
The governor raised the issue recently for the Boreas Tract of the concept of a hut-to-hut system similar to what exists in the White Mountains and similar to what exists in Europe. And that issue was addressed. That's not a new concept, but an issue of having lodging beds and mattresses and cooking facilities in cabins, then called closed cabins, or yurts or huts in the forest preserve, so people would not have to carry tents, sleeping bags, or their food, and that this would encourage use of the forest preserve. I would worry that perhaps if there was a constitutional challenge and we determine now that legally it couldn't be done, that a constitutional convention might have a plank proposed by none less than the governor or allies of the governor that would want to put these hut-to-hut systems on forest preserve.
Well, there does seem to be a lot of support for that concept. And after all, the state has acquired much more land, hundreds of thousands of acres more land, so that land has been taken out of private hands where lodgings were allowed. So I can see support for a concept like that in a constitutional convention. I think that is a possibility.
The public did have a chance to vote on the idea of cabins on the forest preserve and actually rejected it. That was proposed by Robert Moses, I think,
right.
Brought that idea to the public the first time.
And actually, Robert Moses wanted DEC, or the predecessor of DEC, to have the same ability to put these cabins and dining and lodging facilities on the forest preserve as state parks had in Letchworth or Harriman or other state parks. But they're very different. The Forever Wild concept, of course, doesn't apply to any of our large state parks or small state parks. And we feel that this kind of development on the forest preserve would open Judge Bennett, Attorney General Bennett, back in 1932, sought that letting this kind of development occur on the forest preserve would open the floodgate to a whole bunch of other things that were not consistent with maintaining the wild forest character. And we fear that in the Constitutional Convention.
North Country lawmakers are unified in their opposition to a constitutional convention. Assemblyman Dan Steck says he worries about changes to the state's Forever Wild clause. And so does State Senator Betty Little, who tells the Press Republican her biggest fear is amendments being recommended that could be detrimental to the Adirondacks. Both believe the current approach is best, to put amendments before voters, like Senator Little's Forest Preserve Land Bank, that'll be placed on the ballot if approved a second time by the legislature. Governor Andrew Cuomo has been relatively quiet on the topic, although he did tell the editors of the New York Daily News that he fears state lawmakers would end up being the majority of delegates if a convention were held. It is a question that will be debated this summer and fall, and a decision that will be made by voters showing up at the polls this coming November. To learn more about all of this, the Rockefeller Institute of Government has put together a web page to explain the process. You can find a link on our website at mountainlake.org. You can also find an extended version of our studio discussion with our panel of experts.
Mountain Lake Journal on Mountain Lake PBS is made possible in part by
Northern Insuring, guiding your way for 85 years with offices in Plattsburgh, Whitehall, and Messina, providing personal insurance, business insurance, and life and employee benefits services.
Northfind Utilities creates employment and training opportunities for North Country residents with projects that build community and social infrastructure. We're family-focused and education-oriented. Power is our business and pride is our choice.
Knight Automotive, featuring a full selection of the entire Buick lineup in stock, and our world-class rated General Motors technician, Terry Relation, with 40 years of experience. Knight Automotive, Route 3, Plattsburgh.
That is Mountain Lake Journal for this week. I'm Tom Halleck. For all of us at Mountain Lake PBS, have a safe and enjoyable Memorial Day weekend. And we'll see you back here next week.